Imagine an island so small it could fit within the shadow of the empire that sought to destroy it. An island where a few hundred knights, armed with faith and desperation, faced the most powerful army on earth and refused to die quietly. In 1565, the tiny island of Malta became the stage for one of the most savage and unrelenting sieges in human history. What unfolded, there was not a simple battle for territory. It was a brutal contest of will, where both sides crossed every limit of human endurance and morality. This is the story of how 500 knights and a handful of civilians turned their island into a fortress of fire, blood, and legend. In May of 1565, the Ottoman Empire sent 40,000 of its best soldiers to capture a tiny island defended by just 500 knights. The Turks brought 80 siege cannons, including 2 monstrous guns capable of firing 160-pound stone balls. They expected to take Malta in 2 weeks. For months later, they were using the bodies of their own dead comrades as sandbags, while the knights were firing human heads from their cannons. The moats ran red with blood, boiling oil, and melted human fat. This was not merely a siege. It was 4 months of the most savage, brutal, and unhinged combat in military history. Both sides abandoned every rule of war, turning the island into a living hell. By the end of this story, one can understand how 500 knights and 6,000 Maltese civilians held off the greatest empire on earth using tactics so merciless that Ottoman survivors refused to speak about what they had seen. These defenders used everything they could to survive. They turned sewage into weapons, the dead into walls, and human fear into fire. Turkish engineers began refusing orders to approach the fortifications, not because they feared death, but because they feared how they would die. This is the Siege of Malta, where medieval warfare reached its peak of savagery. By 1565, the Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Mediterranean. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, they had conquered Hungary, besieged Vienna, dominated North Africa, and ruled the seas. There is just one obstacle left, a small island between Sicily and Africa, held by an ancient order of warrior monks, the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of St. John. They were the remnants of the Crusaders, expelled from the Holy Land centuries earlier. From Malta, they raided Muslim shipping and defied the Ottoman navy at every turn. Their leader was Jean de Valette, a 71-year-old French nobleman hardened by a lifetime of warfare. He had once been captured and enslaved by Barbary pirates, spending a year chained to an oar. He spoke Arabic and Turkish fluently, and his name was whispered among Ottoman mothers to frighten their children. When spies reported that the Ottoman fleet was coming, de Valette had only 500 knights, roughly 6,000 Maltese militia, and 3 fortresses that military engineers claimed could not hold for a week. The invading Ottoman force was commanded by Mustafa Pasha, the same man who had conquered Rhodes from these very knights 40 years earlier, alongside Admiral Piali Pasha, commanding a fleet of 200 ships. They also brought Dragut, the most feared corsair of the Mediterranean, a master tactician who knew Malta's defenses intimately from decades of raids. The Turks landed on May 18, 1565, confident of swift victory. Malta had no natural resources, no fresh water except for stored rain, and no farmland to feed its people. The knights' main defenses were 3 fortresses, St. Elmo guarding the harbor, and the twin strongholds of Burgu and Sinlia protecting the main settlements. St. Elmo was expected to fall in 3 days. It held for 31, and what happened there set the tone for everything that followed. The Ottomans deployed their heavy bronze cannons, including 2 giants named the Basilisk and the Destroyer of Christians. Day after day, they pounded St. Elmo with up to 7,000 cannonballs. The walls began to collapse, but each night the knights risked their lives to collect the enemy's cannonballs, heat them in furnaces, and fire them back red-hot, setting Ottoman tents and gunpowder alight. As the fortress crumbled, the defenders resorted to madness. They executed Turkish prisoners, drained their blood, and mixed it with clay and limestone to create a cement that hardened in the gaps of shattered walls. When they ran out of prisoners, they used the bodies of their own dead, stuffed into breeches, covered with earth and rubble, becoming part of the defenses themselves. The Turks were literally attacking fortifications made of corpses. The defenders also possessed a terrifying weapon, Greek fire, the lost formula of medieval napalm. The knights' version was even more horrific. They mixed it with human fat rendered from the dead, creating a substance that clung to flesh and could not be extinguished with water. They poured it over attackers, turning men into living torches who spread flames among their own ranks as they fled. On June 3rd, the Janissaries launched their first major assault on St. Elmo. They expected to find broken defenders, but instead met warriors who had turned defense into an art form of horror. The knights used fire hoops, wooden wheels soaked in oil and pitch, which they set ablaze and rolled down upon tightly packed Ottoman troops. They wielded crude flamethrowers called trumpets of fire, which projected jets of burning oil over 30 feet. They hurled clay pots filled with quicklime that exploded into blinding clouds. But the most terrifying weapon was the knights themselves, religious fanatics who believed that dying in battle against the Ottomans guaranteed them heaven. When Turkish soldiers breached the walls, knights would grapple them in iron embraces and hurl themselves off the battlements, ensuring mutual destruction. The ferocity of their fighting stunned even the Janissaries. As the siege dragged on, new horrors emerged. The knights began loading cannons with chains, nails, and broken glass, turning them into massive shotguns. They even packed hollow cannonballs with wildcats, firing them into Ottoman trenches where the terrified animals clawed and bit at everything in sight. And when all proper ammunition was gone, the defenders began using severed heads, fresh, blood-soaked heads, fired from their cannons straight into enemy lines. The Siege of Malta became a nightmare of endurance and savagery unlike anything before it. What had begun as an Ottoman campaign for conquest became a descent into madness and slaughter. By its end, both sides had suffered horrors beyond imagination, but the tiny island still stood. The Knights of St. John had held back an empire, and in doing so, they created one of the most unforgettable and brutal chapters in the history of warfare. The Siege of Malta was one of the most brutal and psychologically devastating conflicts in recorded history, a battle that blurred the line between courage and madness. It was not merely a siege for territory. It was a descent into barbarism, a collision of faith and fury that transformed the island into a living vision of hell. When a Turkish soldier fell in battle, the Knights of St. John responded with a ferocity that defied imagination. They would decapitate the fallen, load the severed heads into cannons, and fire them back toward the Ottoman lines. The effect was horrifying. Ottoman soldiers, exhausted and terrified, would see the faces of men they had eaten breakfast with that same morning flying back through the air, eyes still open, mouths frozen in silent screams. Some of these heads were rigged with crude fuses and small charges of gunpowder, turning them into grotesque bombs that exploded among their comrades. It was psychological warfare of the darkest kind, an assault on the body and the soul. As the siege dragged on, the Ottoman fleet's most feared commander, Dragut Reis, the legendary corsair who had terrorized the Mediterranean for decades, arrived to take charge. His reputation alone had long inspired dread among Christian sailors. But fate was merciless. While inspecting the siege works, a cannonball struck a nearby wall, sending a spray of stone fragments into his skull. Dragut fell, mortally wounded. His agony lasted 4 long days, as fragments of a shattered skull pressed into his brain. The Ottomans tried to conceal his death to preserve morale, but the knights knew immediately. They watched the sudden hesitation in Turkish maneuvers, the disorganization that betrayed the loss of their greatest commander. When Fort St. Elmo finally fell on June 23, 1565, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the Ottomans. 8,000 Turks lay dead, including half of their elite Janissaries, slaughtered in what was supposed to have been an easy conquest. The defenders' losses were staggering as well. Nearly 1,500 Christian soldiers, with only 9 knights captured alive. Those 9, too wounded to survive, died within hours. The Ottoman commanders were horrified. If this tiny fort, barely a speck on a map, had cost so much blood, what would it take to conquer the main strongholds of Burgu and Singlia? In his rage, Mustafa Pasha made a catastrophic mistake. To terrorize the defenders, he ordered that the bodies of the knights from St. Elmo be mutilated, their heads severed, their hearts torn from their chests, and their corpses crucified on wooden crosses. These grisly trophies were floated across the harbor toward Burgu, the main Christian stronghold, as a message of despair. But Mustafa miscalculated. Instead of fear, the gesture ignited fury. Grand Master Jean de Valette, the 71-year-old leader of the Knights of St. John, responded with vengeance of biblical proportion. Every Turkish prisoner within Burgu's walls, hundreds of them, was executed. Their heads were loaded into cannons and fired back across the harbor. One particular head, that of the Ottoman commander's lieutenant, was fired directly into the Turkish command tent, interrupting a staff meeting. It crashed onto the table, rolling to a stop among the horrified officers, its dead eyes staring at the men who had once served beside it. The siege became a macabre contest in creative cruelty. The Ottomans constructed a colossal siege tower mounted on ships to attack from the sea, hoping to overwhelm the defenders with sheer size. The knights waited patiently until the tower was filled with Turkish soldiers, then unleashed chain shot that severed its supports. The entire structure collapsed into the water, drowning hundreds of men in seconds. Turkish swimmers who tried to plant explosives beneath the fortress walls met another nightmare. The knights poured oil into the water and set it ablaze, turning the sea itself into a burning trap. The defenders weaponized everything they could find, even their sewers. They filled barrels with boiling waste, rotting carcasses, and diseased remains, then poured this toxic stew onto Ottoman troops climbing the walls. Those hit by it often died slow, agonizing deaths, and the infection spread like wildfire through the Turkish camps. Dysentery and typhoid claimed more lives than the sword. In July, after weeks of bombardment, the Ottomans finally breached the walls of Burgu using a massive underground mine. Thousands of Turkish soldiers stormed through the gap, expecting to finish the battle quickly. But Grand Master Valette refused to surrender. At 71, he seized a pike, donned armor, and personally led the counterattack. His courage ignited his men's spirits. Eyewitnesses claimed that knights fought on even after being impaled with multiple arrows, some holding their own intestines in with one hand while swinging their swords with the other. The fighting at the breach was beyond comprehension. Men fought atop heaps of corpses in trenches filled with limbs and blood. The dead were piled so high that combat was waged upon their bodies. The knights' final fallback position was known as the Post of Death. Any man assigned there understood that he would not live to see the next dawn. To ensure no one retreated, they chained themselves to the walls, forcing the Ottomans to hack them apart piece by piece to move forward. Summer heat made the carnage even more unbearable. The island became a charnel house of unimaginable stench. Bodies rotted faster than they could be buried. Flies swarmed in such thick clouds that men could barely see. The air was poison, filled with the stench of blood and decomposition. Men vomited inside their helmets as they fought. The ground was slick with gore, and disease spread faster than command orders. The water supply, contaminated with corpses, was undrinkable. Soldiers drank wine instead, knowing water meant certain death from infection. As the siege dragged into August, any pretense of civilization evaporated. Both sides resorted to biological warfare. The knights catapulted plague-ridden corpses into Ottoman lines, while the Turks retaliated by launching severed heads engraved with insults and taunts. Psychological warfare became as important as physical battle. The Turks tortured captured knights within sight of the walls, slowly mutilating them over hours. The knights mirrored the cruelty, using their medical training to prolong the agony of captured Turkish officers, keeping them alive for as long as possible. Even the Maltese civilians joined in the defense with savage determination. Women pretended to surrender to lure Turks into ambushes, where children hamstrung them so their mothers could beat them to death with stones. Elderly men too weak to fight threw themselves onto Ottoman swords, clogging the assault lines with their own bodies. Priests blessed weapons dipped in excrement, ensuring that every wound would fester. One woman, remembered as Katerina, became a legend. When the Turks planted their banner on a captured section of wall, she hurled her own infant at the standard bearer, knocking him backward. Then, seizing the banner, she leapt from the wall with it, choosing death over surrender. Her name would be immortalized by the knights. Both sides continued to develop new ways to inflict pain. The knights designed hollow pikes that could inject boiling oil into wounds and barbed arrows that tore out flesh when removed. They filled clay pots with scorpions and venomous snakes, sealing them until battle, then hurled them into Ottoman ranks. Turkish soldiers fought while scorpions crawled up their legs, biting through armor and flesh alike. On August 7th, the Ottomans launched their greatest assault yet, an all-out offensive from both land and sea that lasted 9 brutal hours. At one point, Ottoman banners flew over Berga's walls. Victory seemed at hand, but Valette, refusing to yield, released 500 galley slaves, promising them freedom if they fought. Desperate and wild, they charged into the fray with the rage of men who had nothing left to lose. The counterattack was devastating. Turks who had made it over the walls were driven back into their own ranks, tumbling into the moats below, pools of blood, oil, and liquefied human remains. The ground was so layered with bodies that it became impossible to walk. Some soldiers refused to advance, not out of fear, but because the heaps of corpses made footing impossible. At times, the killing simply stopped. Both sides, too exhausted to lift their weapons, would collapse among the dead and share water before resuming the fight minutes later. It was not strategy, it was human limitation. By late August, the Ottomans were broken. Supplies had run out, disease was rampant, and morale was collapsing. Rumors spread through the Turkish camp that the knights were cannibals who ate Turkish hearts for strength. It was false, but after months of unimaginable horror, the men believed it. The siege had driven both armies past sanity. The Siege of Malta was not simply a military campaign. It was the unraveling of civilization itself. Faith, courage, hatred, and desperation fused into a nightmare of human endurance and cruelty. By the end, victory and defeat were indistinguishable. Only survival remained. On September 8, 1565, salvation finally arrived for the defenders of Malta. A small Spanish relief force, barely 600 men, landed on the shattered island. But to the exhausted Ottoman invaders watching from the hills, it looked like an entire army. Their scouts exaggerated the size, their morale was already broken, and the illusion spread like wildfire. Mustafa Pasha, fearing encirclement, gave the order to retreat. And with that, the greatest military expedition the Ottoman Empire had ever launched came to a humiliating end. The force that had once numbered 40,000 now left behind 30,000 of its dead. The island was saved by a mere 500 knights and a handful of desperate Maltese defenders. The victory came at an unimaginable cost. When the smoke cleared, Malta looked less like an island and more like the surface of the moon, a wasteland of craters, corpses, and ruins. Every fortress was shattered, every town burned to ashes. The cleanup took months. The dead were so numerous that the survivors had no choice but to burn them in enormous pyres, the smoke of which was said to be visible from Sicily. The soil itself was poisoned with blood and decay. For years, nothing would grow. Even centuries later, archaeologists still uncover cannonballs fused with fragments of human bone embedded in the island's limestone walls, silent reminders of what had transpired. Suleiman the Magnificent, who had once envisioned Malta as the gateway to conquering Rome, was enraged when he heard of the defeat. He immediately began assembling an even greater armada, determined to erase the island and the Knights of St. John from existence. But fate intervened. Before his preparations could be completed, Suleiman died, and with him died the Ottoman dream of pushing westward into the heart of Europe. The Siege of Malta became more than a military failure. It was a turning point that marked the end of Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. 500 knights had broken an empire's momentum. In the aftermath, the Knights of St. John rebuilt Malta with grim determination. Under the leadership of Grand Master Jean de Valette, they constructed a new capital, Valletta, named in his honor. Every street was designed for defense. Every building could be converted into a fortress. The entire city was built to withstand another siege, with sloped bastions, interlocking lines of fire, and underground tunnels. The knights were preparing for an enemy that never came. The Ottomans, humbled by their losses, never attempted another invasion. They had learned a terrible truth, that some victories cost more than defeat. The survivors of the siege were changed men. Turkish veterans who returned home refused to speak of what they had seen. Many suffered mental breakdowns, though such terms didn't exist at the time. The knights, hailed as heroes across Europe, carried invisible scars. They had lived through 4 months of ceaseless bombardment and close-quarter fighting so brutal that conventional warfare afterward felt trivial. Many never took up arms again, not from wounds, but from a kind of soul-deep exhaustion that future generations would recognize as psychological trauma. The Siege of Malta didn't just change empires, it changed warfare itself. Both sides had resorted to tactics that shattered every concept of civilized combat. They poisoned wells, catapulted decaying bodies to spread disease, mutilated prisoners, and used psychological warfare to break morale. It was total war in an age that still spoke of honor and chivalry. Military historians later studied these events under what they called the Malta Model, a grim blueprint of what happens when all restraint is lost. The conclusion was universal. Wars fought without limits destroy not just armies, but humanity itself. Yet the real legacy of Malta was psychological. The Ottoman Empire, once viewed as an unstoppable superpower, had been stopped, not by another empire, but by a few hundred men fortified by fanatic resolve. The knights proved that determination, when pushed to its most brutal form, could defy impossible odds. Their defiance echoed through the centuries, influencing revolutions and resistance movements around the world. From the American colonies to Afghanistan, people would remember Malta as proof that even the smallest force could stand against empire if it was willing to pay any price. But that defiance came at a terrible moral cost. The Knights of Malta had turned their island into a charnel house. They used corpses as barricades, hurled decapitated heads as ammunition, and weaponized thirst by cutting off the Ottomans' access to water. They betrayed every Christian virtue they claimed to defend. Yet they won. The Ottoman Empire's greatest defeat did not come from a powerful army, but from 500 men who decided that turning their home into hell was preferable to surrender. Today, Malta's fortifications still stand, scarred, silent, and enduring. Cannonballs are still embedded in its walls. Some with traces of human remain sealed inside. The island remains a monument to the extremes of human endurance and cruelty. The Siege of Malta was not merely a victory of arms. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature. The defenders had protected their faith using methods that would have horrified the very Christ they claimed to serve. When physicians later examined survivors, the physical horrors they uncovered defied belief. Knights were found whose bones had healed incorrectly after being broken in battle, their limbs twisted by improper healing. Others had sword fragments or musket balls embedded in their bodies, their flesh grown around the metal. Infections were rampant. One knight had continued fighting despite a gangrenous leg that was literally rotting away. He tied it to his thigh with rope and fought for 3 more days before dying. Turkish physicians recorded similar atrocities. Janissaries blinded by quicklime, continuing to fight by sound alone, swinging their swords at any voice that spoke Maltese. The suffering endured by both sides surpassed anything the medical world of the 16th century could comprehend. The economic devastation was no less severe. The Ottoman Empire had poured 3 years' worth of revenue into the siege. It had lost many of its best engineers, elite janissaries, and naval officers, the backbone of its Mediterranean might. The loss of over 200 seasoned naval captains crippled Ottoman sea power for a generation. The empire's aura of invincibility was shattered, sparking revolts among Christian slaves and subject peoples. Venice and Spain, sensing weakness, began pursuing more aggressive policies in the region. The financial shock rippled through Constantinople, war bonds defaulted, markets collapsed, and imperial treasuries were drained. The wealth that could have conquered Italy was gone, replaced by 30,000 graves on a rocky island that produced nothing but death. Even more disturbing was the legacy Malta left upon European warfare. The survivors, both knights and mercenaries, carried its methods home with them. Commanders who had studied or fought at Malta began using human remains as tools of psychological warfare in later conflicts. The 30 Years' War saw heads mounted on walls and bodies used as barriers, tactics directly inspired by the siege. Military manuals began referring to Malta defenses, outlining extreme measures for desperate situations. Europe had learned a terrible lesson, that any atrocity could be justified if survival was the goal. War itself became more ruthless, as if Malta had given permission for barbarity that civilization had once condemned. And then came the final, bitter irony. Ottoman documents discovered centuries later revealed that Suleiman had already planned to withdraw his army if Malta hadn't fallen by early September, fearing the autumn storms that would devastate his fleet. The siege's last and bloodiest month, the massacres, the starvation, the unimaginable suffering had been entirely unnecessary. By the time the Spanish reinforcements landed, the Ottomans were already preparing to leave. Thousands of men had died for nothing more than inertia, the sheer momentum of violence that neither side could stop. If the Spanish fleet had arrived just weeks earlier, the island might have been spared its worst horrors. Instead, both sides continued fighting long after logic had died. The siege had become its own machine, fueled only by revenge, pride, and hatred. Each atrocity demanded another in return. By the time it ended, no one could remember why it had begun. The Siege of Malta proved one of the most haunting truths of human history. Wars can outlive their purpose. They can evolve into engines of suffering that continue long after strategy and reason have vanished. In the end, the Siege of Malta was not just a story of courage or faith. It was a revelation that once humanity crosses a certain threshold of savagery, there may be no way back. The defenders won the battle, but at a cost so terrible that it reshaped the conscience of Europe. What remained was not triumph, but a warning that sometimes to win, we must first lose a part of our own humanity.